In 1924, 5 workers at a Standard Oil refinery in New Jersey started hallucinating, then convulsing, then dying. The press called the substance that killed them loony gas, and the man who'd invented it held a press conference, washed his hands in the stuff, breathed in its fumes to prove it was safe. He had to take a leave of absence afterward to recover from lead poisoning, and for the next 70 years, every car on Earth sprayed his invention into the air that children breathed. You're listening to The Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, what if the 20th century's worst crime wave wasn't caused by poverty, drugs, or bad policing, but by car exhaust? The man who started it all was Thomas M.I.J. Lee Jr., a mechanical engineer working for General Motors in Dayton, Ohio. The year was 1921, and he had a problem to solve. Car engines knocked, the pistons rattled, and M.I.J. Lee found that adding a compound called tetraethylide to gasoline made the knocking stop. It was cheap, it was effective, and it was one of the most potent neurotoxins humans had ever mass-produced. The warning signs came early. At the production facilities, first in Dayton, then in Deepwater, New Jersey, workers started losing their minds. They staggered through hallways, swatting at invisible insects. They screamed at things no one else could see. At the Standard Oil refinery, the building where tetraethylide was processed got a nickname, the Loony Gas Building. 5 men died at that refinery in October of 1924. Dozens more were hospitalized. The public health outcry was immediate. Newspapers demanded answers. The Surgeon General convened an investigation, and Thomas M.I.J. Lee, the inventor himself, stood up at a press conference, poured tetraethylide over his hands, and held a flask of it under his nose for 60 seconds. "I'm not taking any chances whatsoever," he told reporters, "nor would I take any chances doing that every day." He was lying, or at least his body knew he was lying. M.I.J. Lee had to leave work for months afterward to recover from lead poisoning. But the press conference worked, the investigation stalled, production resumed, and by the mid-1930s, virtually every gallon of gasoline sold in the United States contained M.I.J. Lee's additive. Here's what nobody was measuring at the time. Lead doesn't just poison factory workers who handle it in concentrated form. When you burn leaded gasoline in a car engine, lead particles come out the tailpipe. They hang in the air, they settle into soil, they drift through open windows. And children who breathe faster, who put their hands in their mouths, who play on the ground, absorb far more of it than adults. Micro Cliffhanger 1. The damage lead does to a child's brain is specific. It targets one region in particular. And what that region controls would explain something that wouldn't puzzle anyone for another 50 years. Lead is neurotoxic at any level of exposure. There's no safe amount. And it has a particular affinity for the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and the ability to consider consequences before acting. A child exposed to lead doesn't just get a lower IQ, though that happens too. They become more impulsive, more aggressive, less able to regulate their own behavior. The damage is permanent, and it scales with exposure. The more lead, the worse the effect. Now, from the 1920s through the 1970s, cars pumped lead into the atmosphere continuously. Every highway, every city street, every suburban road. The children who lived near those roads breathed it in, absorbed it through their skin, ate it in contaminated soil. Millions of children. Tens of millions. In every city, in every country, where cars ran on leaded gasoline. And those children grew up. A child exposed to peak lead levels in 1965 would reach the age of peak criminal offending, roughly 20 years old, around 1985. That's not a coincidence. That's a prediction. Because 1985 is almost exactly when the American violent crime rate began its terrifying climb toward its 1991 peak. Micro Cliffhanger 2. But the real evidence for this theory doesn't come from one country. It comes from what happened when different countries banned leaded gasoline at different times. Before the lead theory, criminologists had a buffet of explanations for why crime dropped so dramatically in the 1990s. Some credited the explosion of mass incarceration. By the mid-90s, the United States was locking up more people per capita than any nation on Earth. Others pointed to new policing strategies, CompStat in New York, community policing initiatives nationwide. Economist Stephen Levitt controversially argued that the legalization of abortion in 1973 reduced the number of unwanted children who would have grown into at-risk adults, timing that roughly matched the crime decline. Each theory had data behind it. Each had advocates, but each also had the same problem. They were local to the United States. Mass incarceration was an American phenomenon. CompStat was a New York phenomenon. Legalized abortion followed country-specific timelines, and yet the crime drop happened everywhere. Not just in America, in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, countries with wildly different policing, wildly different incarceration rates, wildly different abortion laws. The decline happened in all of them. But not at the same time. It happened 20 years after each country banned leaded gasoline. Economist Rick Nevin published the cross-country analysis in 2000. He looked at 9 countries that had phased out leaded gasoline at different times: the United States, Canada, Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, and Finland. The phase-out dates were different, the legal systems were different, the demographics were different, the policing was different. The result was the same. In every single country, violent crime rose roughly 20 years after lead exposure peaked, and fell roughly 20 years after the phase-out began. The correlation held across all 9 nations. Jessica Wolpaw-Reyes, an economist at Amherst College, took it further. She looked at state-by-state data within the United States because different states adopted unleaded gasoline at different rates. States that reduced lead exposure earlier saw their crime rates drop earlier. States that were slower to transition saw their crime rates drop later. The pattern held at the state level just as clearly as it held at the national level. This is the theory's strongest evidence and its most disturbing implication. If the correlation is causal, then millions of violent crimes committed between the 1960s and the 1990s weren't caused by moral failure or poverty or bad parenting or any of the explanations that shaped criminal justice policy for decades. They were caused by an industrial product that was pumped into the air by every car on every road in every country on Earth. It's worth saying what the lead crime hypothesis is not. It's not a claim that lead was the only cause of the crime wave or that other factors didn't matter. Mass incarceration had an effect, policing had an effect, economics had an effect, but the lead theory is the only one that explains why the pattern repeated across countries with nothing else in common. There's one more detail about Thomas M.I.J. Lee Jr. He didn't just invent leaded gasoline, he also invented chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, the chemicals that tore a hole in the ozone layer. One environmental historian called him the single most destructive organism in the history of the Earth. He holds patents on 2 of the most damaging industrial chemicals humans ever produced. And both times he was warned. Both times workers got sick. Both times he pushed forward. In 1944, M.I.J. Lee, by then disabled from polio, strangled to death in a system of ropes and pulleys he'd designed to help himself out of bed. He died tangled in his own invention. It was ruled accidental, and the gasoline kept burning. For another 50 years in some countries, Algeria, the last nation on Earth to sell leaded gasoline, didn't stop until 2021. The United Nations called the global phase-out one of the most important environmental achievements in history. But the lead that came out of those tailpipes for 70 years? It's still here, in the soil next to highways, in the paint on old houses, in the pipes that carry water to homes in cities like Flint, Michigan, where in 2014 children were being poisoned by the same element through the same mechanism with the same neurotoxic effects. The experiment ran for 70 years. Nobody consented to it. And the data says it may have been the largest unintentional act of mass neurological damage in human history. Here's what stays with me. For decades, we looked at rising crime and asked what was wrong with the people committing it. We built more prisons. We wrote harsher laws. We debated whether violence was cultural or genetic, or the inevitable result of poverty. And the whole time, there was lead in the air. A known neurotoxin sprayed from every tailpipe, settling into the lungs of children who had no idea what was happening to their brains. The crime wave wasn't a mystery of human nature, it may have been a chemistry problem. And the people who paid for it, with prison sentences, with ruined lives, with early deaths, they never got to hear that explanation. Most of them still haven't. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend, but maybe don't tell them it's all real until after they've finished. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.